Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for coming to tonight's talk. So we are very honored to be hosting Dr. Jayant Menon to talk about the new economic challenges facing Malaysia. So we are about nearly 5 months into the new administration, and certainly a lot has been happening. So Dr. Menon will give his insights into, what are the new challenges that's facing the new administration, particularly when most of the ministers are still quite new to their jobs. So what they should be doing and where should Malaysia go next in that sense. So Dr. Jayant Menon is the lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist at the Asian Development Bank in Manila, where he works on trade, international investment, and also development issues. He joined the ADB in 1999 and has worked on the India desk, the Regional Economic Monitoring Unit, the Southeast Asia Department, the Office for Regional Economic Integration, and the ADB Institute in Tokyo. One of his key accomplishments at the ADB was to develop the trade stream and assemble a team which he later headed. Prior to joining the ADB, he has worked as an academic for more than a decade, holding positions in Monash University, University of Melbourne, Victoria University, and the American University. Without further ado, Dr. Menon, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pedro. First of all, let me thank all of you for making it out here so late in the evening. I've never actually given a talk this late. I've never been to a talk this late. So I hope it's worth your while that you should come out after, obviously, for some of you, a long day at work. And I hope you enjoy the presentation and participate in the Q&A at the end of this, and I'm certainly looking forward to learning from you as well in terms of what the new government in Malaysia can and needs to do to realize the great expectations that I think we all hold for them after the remarkable change in political parties that we recently witnessed. And let me also thank the PENANG Institute for hosting me here. It's been a few decades since I've been back in Penang, but first time in the PENANG Institute, and it's fantastic to be in this lovely building. Okay, so I don't want to speak for much more than 45 minutes, maybe even less than that, so we have more time. So let me get started with the presentation. So I think we all know now, it's cliche about how remarkable this change in government was. I do a lot of work in Cambodia, and I would have imagined the unthinkable happening in Cambodia with a change in government there before a change in government in Malaysia. But Malaysia has done it before Cambodia, and this is amazing. And I think, I wouldn't say this myself, but luckily the Economist magazine, in a subtitle to an article, said the following: the government, incumbent government then, tried every dirty trick in the book, but still lost. And so I think that basically highlights the appetite for change that we have witnessed. So I want to try and talk about the following questions in this presentation. I want to start off by looking at what I think are some of the key economic challenges facing this new government, what's required in the sense of reforms to try and meet those challenges. And then finally, I want to try and visit this topic of, what kind of change can we reasonably expect? We have heightened expectations. We have to temper them, I guess, with realities and constraints, the burden of history, the plural society that we live in. All these factors can impinge upon change, but how are they likely to play out going forward? Okay. So there are many challenges, and you can read about them almost every day if you pick up the newspapers. The newspapers are once again worth reading. I can see. I read them every day on the internet ever since the change in government. Before I only looked for the advertisements. Now you can actually read the articles. So there are many challenges. Here's a short list. It's not comprehensive. These are the ones I want to talk about. Firstly, arresting premature deindustrialization. I'll describe that in detail in a minute. Reviving foreign and domestic investment, reducing youth unemployment, and creating good jobs. Addressing all kinds of inequality, and finally, improving governance and strengthening institutions. So let me start with this issue of premature deindustrialization. Actually, this term was coined by a Harvard economist called Danny Roderick. Some of you would have come across his work. And he was talking about countries that, because of various technological shocks or terms of trade shocks, their manufacturing sectors started contracting too early, before their economies fully matured, and services grew too quickly, and manufacturing shrunk too rapidly as well, and sometimes agriculture too. Now, the latest manufacturing survey, which is dated 2012, the new one hasn't come out yet, showed that the subsector within manufacturing, the biggest subsector is no longer electronics, right? It used to be electronics. Now it's petroleum refining and palm oil processing, right? With 19% and 12% respectively, okay? Now, why is this a problem? The problem is that these are highly capital-intensive sectors, right, that produce very few jobs. And the jobs they produce are not high-paying jobs, okay? In fact, a lot of the workers are foreign workers, okay? So in terms of sustaining the workforce, these sectors aren't very useful, okay? In fact, the same can be said about electronics as well, which is, you know, largely manned now with foreign workers. But certainly there are a higher share of good jobs in electronics than there are in petroleum refining and palm oil processing. Electronics still hires engineers and other people with higher skills than these other sectors, okay? So therein lies the problem within manufacturing. Now, associated with that is a falling share of trade as a percentage of GDP, okay? You can see that this has been dropping around from about the global financial crisis, okay? Around the early 2000s. And both exports and imports have been falling. Malaysia remains a highly open trading nation, but the share of trade has been dropping. Yes, although you can see the gap between those two lines since, again, the early 2000s suggests we now run a trade surplus. Okay, exports are growing higher than imports, but they track each other quite closely because of this global value chain trade, right? We import a lot of the inputs and then we add a bit of value and export them again in electronics and other related industries. Okay, so so the structure of the Malaysian economy is changing as if it's becoming advanced industrialized economy, but if you look more closely, the high-paying services jobs are limited, and the jobs within manufacturing are now also not the kind that we need to sustain high living standards. Okay? So if you go back to the early post-colonial days, Malaysia was heavily dependent on commodities, right? Rubber and tin. And we did a bit of processing of them, but we mainly exported those. Now we've gone back to commodities. It's just that the commodities themselves have changed, right? It's palm oil and oil, okay? So that's the concern, right? In the structural transformation towards a high-income, advanced country, as envisioned in, the Vision 2020, and this needs to be addressed. Okay. Now, related to this is the slowdown in both foreign investment and domestic private investment. Okay. In a sense, FDI, or foreign direct investment, never really recovered from the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, okay? And this is true for many countries affected by the AFC, not just Malaysia, okay? But Malaysia also became a net exporter of capital since about 2006. You can see the red line there from about 2006 exceeding the blue line. That's red line is outflows and blue line is foreign investment coming in, until very recently, where suddenly outflows also collapsed. Okay? Right, but the point here is that FDI, which was the engine of growth for so long, has dropped significantly and never really recovered. Okay? Yeah. How about investment, domestic investment, or gross fixed capital formation, as it's called? Here again, you can see that sharp decline after the Asian financial crisis of 97, and it's really just, kept its share relatively constant after that. Okay, from about, you can see this thing here. And if you look at the difference between government investment, public and private, again, before the financial crisis, the blue bar was quite large. Everything dropped sharply, but the red bar started playing a bigger role until quite recently. Okay? But overall, again, total investment is way below what it used to be before the Asian financial crisis, right? The blue bars have lately, towards the end, been recovering, right? And people hope that this is a good thing with GLCs not crowding out investment. But investment by GLCs are also considered as private investment, right? Because they're not government companies, they are government-linked companies. So it's still not clear whether this is the private sector coming back into the picture or just GLCs boosting their investment further. But I'll come back to this point a bit later. Okay, so that's the investment story. Also a problem that needs to be addressed. Now, youth unemployment, right, is 3 times the average at more than 10%. Now, this is usually a problem for rich countries, right, for European countries. So we've got the problems of the rich countries, but not the trappings, unfortunately. So 25% of university graduates remain unemployed 6 months after graduating. Okay? And this in a context where employers complain about difficulties getting talent. Okay? So this clearly points to skills mismatch. Okay? So people are graduating with skills that are not in demand by employers, who then complain they can't get skilled workers. Okay? Um, so the skills mismatch has its roots in a broken education system, right? There's a high share of graduates who are unemployed. There's no other way to read it than something terribly wrong with the system that produces them. Okay, so now Malaysia may be a net importer of labor, but it's certainly a net exporter of skills. Okay, they're different things. Okay, so we import a lot of low-skilled labor, but skilled workers tend to migrate to receptive countries like Australia, New Zealand, some European countries, Canada, and the US. Okay, and this adds to both the problems employers face at home, and it continues to be a problem for young graduates looking to join the workforce. Okay, now all of this is also taking place in the context of rising inequality. Now, if you look at the government numbers on income inequality, these are the numbers, they've actually been falling, right? They're still high, right? They're still, overall income inequality is still 0.4, right? The Gini is 0.4, which is the threshold for high inequality, but it's been coming down, right? And it's also high within all the different communities. Intercommunal differences have been narrowing, right? We know that, especially between Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra. Those differences have been narrowing. But some of those have been replaced by rising differences within the groups, okay? But overall, income inequality has been falling, but income inequality is a very crude measure of overall inequality, right? The difficult measure to calculate is wealth disparity, right? Wealth inequality. And data there is both limited and unreliable, okay? Because people don't declare all their wealth for obvious reasons, and in fact there are no official statistics on wealth disparities, okay? But there are indirect indicators of rising wealth and other inequality, right? Wage inequality is rising within the country, and all forms of social marginalization and exclusion are rising, with pockets of poverty emerging all over the place, you know, within rural communities, particularly in some of the more backward states. You are fortunate to be in one of the more advanced states here in Penang, right? Yeah. And if you look at this, I don't expect you to be able to read everything, but you can see, just to give you a broad picture, half of Malaysians earn below 2,000 ringgit a month, okay? And only a third of them have tertiary qualifications, and the mean is 1,703, okay? And as we all know, cost of living is rising, right? Not always due to the government, but, you know, external factors like rising oil prices and now a potential all-out trade war. But certainly living standards are under a lot of pressure, right? And I think this is going to be a major challenge for this new government going forward, because you cannot have sustainable growth if these disparities continue to widen, right? They will eventually lead to social instability and, in the worst case scenario, political problems. And, you know, the Arab Spring is just one example, but there are many others. Right. Okay, moving along, and this has been a lot in the news. Malaysia, of course, is facing quite a large debt constraint, and the government has produced a new debt number, and this debt number, this is what it looks like. This is not the traditional measure that is used by the rating agencies and other international agencies, but it does provide, I think, a more holistic representation of overall obligations, right? And the government debt that is reported by the previous government is that number 686.8, okay? And this government has placed more attention on the two new components, which is the private public lease payments of 200 billion and the government guarantees of 199 billion, okay? These were always there, they weren't hidden, except that this government has felt it necessary to actually shine the torch on them, right? To raise more awareness of these other numbers, because they claim that the previous government had been trying to engineer debt in a way that reduced the official number and increased these off-balance sheet numbers, okay? Now, if they're doing that, then you should be looking at both, right? To get a better idea of what future generations will be burdened with, right? Even the current generation, okay? So I think it's useful to look at these things and have a fuller picture, although I think it's also fair to say that it's not, the 686 number is the number that most countries report, and that's what rating agencies use. But if you're trying to engineer things in a way that underestimates that number and puts things off balance sheet, then we should have both and look at both in terms of getting a full picture of liabilities. Okay, but whichever way, debt is an issue, and it's going to be a constraint on future growth unless it's addressed. Okay, and finally, this has been talked a lot about, been a lot discussed, especially with the change in government. You know, the new government has committed to better manage public resources, you know, to try and limit corruption, and I think it's important to recognize that, you know, old-fashioned financial corruption and corruption of institutions feed off each other, right? The degradation of institutional quality of the judiciary, the police, the press, and even the anti-corruption agencies, right, needs to be addressed if you're going to deal with improving the investment climate and going forward with a better system of governance, okay? Yeah. But to deliver this kind of change, the public bureaucracy has to be on board, right? And I think this is another challenge facing the government, right? The bureaucracy has only known one master for 61 years. They also, I think it's an open secret, they are quite politicized, so they will have to be brought along or dragged along, or whichever way, but they need to be participating in the reform program, or nothing will get implemented the way we want it to. Okay, right. Okay, so that's, I think, some of the key challenges facing the government, but I want to now focus in on two issues that I think are both important and interrelated, right? There are many factors to be overcome, but the two issues I'm going to focus on the reform of government-linked corporations and the dealing with the affirmative action program going forward, right? And the two are related because in Malaysia, unlike any other country that I'm aware of, government-linked corporations were given an explicit role in the affirmative action program. Okay, so if you have to address both of them, I think, if you're going to deal with these key challenges facing the government. Okay, and this is an area I've been working on for a while, and when I wrote about this a few years ago, I came under a lot of criticism, and especially not just from the head of PNB, Tan Sri Abdul Wahid, who has subsequently stepped down. But I think he's a good man in a difficult position. And what he had to say about my paper for ideas was that, you know, if I think that GLCs contribute towards income disparity or the crowding out of private investment or poor governance, these are all totally misplaced. I think subsequently now we have seen that with the new information that's come out, many of these concerns are real. And Khazanah was also very critical of what I wrote, and we have subsequently seen how, you know, the board has actually resigned, and they're looking to make significant reforms of the GLICs as well as GLCs. So maybe let me start there with that. But first of all, it's come back into the debate just before the elections, when some of you might remember this, Dr. Mahathir claimed that they'd lost the original function and it become so huge and rich that they're now monsters, right? He called them monsters. And then there's now been evidence that's been revealed that both Khazanah and Bank Negara had been used, their revenues had been used to service the debt of one MDB. In fact, the governor of Bank Negara resigned almost immediately. And as I said, the board of Khazanah subsequently resigned, offered their resignation en masse, which has been now accepted, right? So clearly there's a problem. It's become very clear with evidence with the new government. So what do we do, right? So with GLICs, the government-linked investment companies, the ones that feed the funds to the GLCs, the Khazanahs and, you know, the Tabung Hajis and Tabung Tentra and all of them, PNB and so on. With them, I think it's a bit easier, right? And this is already kind of taking place. They've all been moved out of the Ministry of Finance, incorporated into the new ministry with Minister Azmin in charge of Economic Affairs. And so others have proposed, like Professor Jomo and Professor Terence Gomez, who've been working on this for a lot longer than I have. They've suggested the formation of an independent body with operational oversight, institutional autonomy, and also putting in internal management reforms, right? And I think that can be done and is being done for the GLICs, right? And this is important because unlike GLCs, most of the GLICs are not publicly listed and so don't have that open scrutiny, right? Yeah. So that's happening with the GLICs, but with GLCs it's a bit more difficult, right? So we need to think a bit harder about how we deal with them, okay? And as I said earlier, GLCs were uniquely tasked to help the government with their Bumiputra program, okay? In two ways. Firstly, by creating a new class of Bumiputra entrepreneurs within the GLCs themselves, and then through a process of divestment. Okay, um, but now we can look back, and what we see is that huge sums of monies were involved, and for the amount of money involved and the cost of the distortions that they created, the benefits to the Bhumiputra were present, but were unjustifiably small, right? And also unequally distributed. Okay, so this is not to deny that there were benefits, but they were not. They didn't justify the sums of money involved, and they seemed to be distributed to the upper echelon rather than, the average Bhumiputra, right? And I think this is because GLCs are really the wrong instrument, right? They might have had, the right intentions, if you believe so, but they were the wrong instrument, whatever you, given the objectives at hand. And they led to crony capitalism, state dependence, regulatory capture, and grand corruption. Okay? And also there's empirical evidence, work that I've done with my colleague from ADB, Bernard Ng, that shows that GLCs have also been crowding out private investment, right? A concern that was first raised in 2011 when former Prime Minister Najib launched the new economic model. Okay, so there's evidence for this now that clearly shows that this has been happening. So, what should be done? How do we deal with the GLCs? Okay, I think the first point to recognize is that they are both good and bad GLCs, right? In the same way that there's, a legitimate role for government in business. Okay, if a GLC is not crowding out private investment, if it's operating efficiently, and it's performing a social function, right? Then there's no need to divest or worry about them, right? It's when they're not doing these things that we should look carefully at them and look at possible ways of reforming them, right? But just because a GLC is doing well in terms of its financial performance doesn't necessarily mean that it's efficient, right? One of the things that we do know about GLCs is they receive a lot of preferential treatment, right? They have, with government control, they can actually access government contracts more easily. Procurement deals are explicitly written to favor Bhumiputra companies, and many of them are GLCs, right? And in that sense, we need to be careful, right? This may be good performance driven by preferences rather than efficiencies, okay? And if that's the case, this is still a tax on public resources and on consumers, okay? So we need to separate those two things in assessing which GLCs are really doing well and the ones that need to be reformed, okay? Yeah. And if we do decide on a divestment program, right, we should be careful how public assets are divested, right? They should be disposed at fair market value, and we should avoid a case where there's concentration of market power or wealth in the hands of a few. Now, if you followed the Wall Street Journal articles on this, they will argue that this happened during Prime Minister Mahathir's previous reign, where a lot of connected people of all races, right? In fact, many of them were not Bhumiputras, benefited greatly from the so-called privatization and divestment program. Okay, so that needs to be avoided, and it should be, a public listing that allows, the citizens to participate in the process more fairly, rather than just the cronies. Right. And also we have to ask ourselves, right, what are GLCs doing in areas like real estate, property development, construction, retail, and media, right? Yeah. These are not social goods. These are not natural monopolies. Why are they there in such a towering way, right? Why are some of them, even operating under monopoly-like conditions, still making losses? Okay, yeah. In fact, the Ministry of Finance Incorporated itself showed that 15 companies were making losses in 2015, and many of these losses were off balance sheet. Okay, so what we need is to get at the final list of GLCs requiring reform, we need a proper detailed study of all GLCs, right? We usually hear about the big GLCs, the ones that are dominant and household names that are in the stock market and so on, but there's hundreds of them in the state level, right? And there's all these statutory bodies and so on, and they don't come under the spotlight, and they too need to be looked at, right? And we do need a proper detailed study of big and small GLCs to determine which ones need reform or divestment or both. Right. Okay. So that's my story about GLCs. So I think I want to move on to the second issue, and this is bringing back meritocracy into the system, right? And whether in fact the new government has the mandate to do so, okay? And this is the elephant in the room, right, which hasn't been really talked about very much, although I'll show you in a minute how it has in fact been mentioned for a long time, and also more recently, right? The Bumiputra program, or the affirmative action program. It started with the NEP, the New Economic Policy, and if you go back to the original NEP, we find that its original tenets were very clear, right? It was poverty eradication regardless of race, and eliminating the identification of race with economic function, okay? Those were the clearly stated original tenets. And at the time, this made good sense, right? In 1960s and soon after that, more than 52% of the population lived in poverty, and the vast majority were rural Malay farmers, okay? Of course, there were pockets of poverty amongst the Chinese and the Indian communities, but the vast majority were Malay farmers, right? And so, in that context, you didn't need to check on socioeconomic status in providing preferential treatment, right? You could have, but it wouldn't have mattered. It would have been redundant, okay? Means testing would not have been very useful, okay? But after the first 20 years, right, it became quite clear that things were getting quite entrenched, and that most of the target audience, although they benefited originally, right, were no longer benefiting in any significant way. But then a very small minority were making huge gains, okay? So in the initial phase of the NEP, we saw a sharp drop in poverty, okay? And a lot of rural Malay farmers were lifted out of poverty, as were poor Malay and poor Chinese and Indian plantation and tin mine workers. But then after that is when things got complicated, okay, after the first 20 years. But things continued without means testing, right? Okay, so here I have a few quotes, and since I've been talking for so long, I want to try and get you to see if you can tell me who said each one of these three things, okay? The first one is, let me read it out. The NEP is like crutches, which when used too long would result in atrophy of the muscles, making the users so dependent that their inherent capability regresses. Okay? That's the first quote. I'm not going to tell you who said it yet. Mahathir? Yes, okay. So that wasn't hard in his memoirs, right? Yeah. I think the medical reference also is a bit of a giveaway, probably. Okay. All right, let's try the next one, okay? It's time to review the NEP's implementation to make the program market-friendly, merit-based, transparent, and needs-based. Who do you think said this? Anwar? Anyone else? Najib. Yes, this was Najib, right? Launching the new economic model in 2012, okay? And then this one, economic policies should not be based on race, but on needs instead. Anwar again? Not Anwar. Anwar said all of these things, but so we know what he says. So these are the ones you're not supposed to guess easily. Azmin, yes, just a month and a couple of months ago, okay? Azmin, okay? So we have people from way back, previous regime, current regime, saying all of these things, right? Okay? So I feel safe saying it now because they're saying it, so. Yeah, the question is, will they do it? Right, okay. So I think, you know, the difficulty has been implementation. Everyone's recognized the problem at all levels, at the highest levels of government, right? The question is, how do we do it without rocking the boat? Okay. So I think, in my view, the way to do it is firstly, recognize that it's not a binary choice. It's not all or nothing, right? It's not like we need to overhaul the whole NEP, right? Or whatever you call it now, okay? There's a broad spectrum of choices that lie in between, okay? Right. I should hurry up. There's no such thing as a pure system of meritocracy, right? You know, people often think of Singapore as the beacon of meritocracy. Even they have a rotating race-based president, okay? And the Prime Minister's wife happens to be the head of their biggest wealth fund. Coincidence, okay? So, you know, meritocracy is not a definite thing, it's a degree, right? And I think in a multicultural society or multiracial society, you need to strike that balance between meritocracy and society. The problem is that it's gone too far in one direction, and it's been unsuccessful, right? It's been unfair to all, right? And now it's also becoming unsustainable, okay? You cannot keep squeezing a minority to continuously subsidize a growing majority, okay? So it's going to break sooner or later. So it's not really a choice anymore. Something needs to be done. And I think the way to do it would be not to think about it as a racial issue, right? Or a racial redistribution issue, but rather a break with a system that's been corrupted, right? A system of patronage and cronyism, okay? You know, if you apply a race-based quota that results in the most politically connected within that race getting the benefits, right? You don't help that race, right? And furthermore, patronage politics cuts across race, okay? Especially at the top end of the wealth distribution. Okay, so people of all races have benefited through the system because of their connections, right? And that's the problem, right? And that's why I think large numbers of Malays and non-Malays feel left behind in this program, right? And I think if we can reform the system in this way, the main beneficiaries, paradoxically, could be the Malays in the long run, right? Because they are the majority, okay? And this is a switch that will benefit the majority in the long run, right? The poorer Malays are the ones that see more benefits than they do right now in a system that's supposed to be targeted to help them, okay? So the gains, I think, to the majority would take place at the expense of a small minority, okay, of political patrons and cronies of all races, okay? So cronyism is colorblind, right? So all of them, I think, would lose and the majority would gain. Okay, I'm running out of time, so let me try and finish off by talking a little bit about the challenges facing this government. Another 5 minutes? Yeah, I'll just finish at 5 minutes. Okay. So I think we know that there are a lot of challenges facing this government, and the challenges are wide-ranging, and we need a government that will be able to deal with these difficult reforms, okay? But we have, in reality, a coalition government whose main bond is convenience, okay? These are a group of parties that have come together with the sole objective of defeating the incumbents, right? That's the truth, like it or not. And this is not the first time it's happened. It happened in Sri Lanka in 2015 when another coalition government came in and toppled the Rajapaksa government, right? That had bigger corruption ideas, I think, but today that coalition is struggling, right? And they look like they might not win the next election, and Rajapaksa, in the form of his brother, might return, okay? So this is a lesson that we need to look at carefully of loosely bound coalitions, okay? It doesn't mean it cannot work, but it means it's going to be difficult, okay? There's a lot of diversity across the parties and even within the parties, okay? So which party or which person will anchor the coalition going forward, right? And how will the others within the parties and outside the parties react, okay? We saw early signs of not conflict really, but tensions with the cabinet appointments, but these were quickly resolved, okay? But we are now in the honeymoon period. Nothing can really upset things in this period, but we are quickly migrating out of the honeymoon period, okay? And I guess the big challenge will eventually be the leadership transition, okay? And we will have to hope that that goes well when that happens, but that's going to be an issue, right? And people will play on these, emerging cracks within the coalition. They should be ready for that, right? And this has already started happening. A former MP called Taufik Ismail, whom I've never heard of, but I was interested to see what he had to say, and this was reported widely in the press, right? Where he said, the purge of GLC chiefs, these were the ones that were, almost some of them were actually directly linked to corruption, some indirectly. Said it was one step too far, and using Guan Eng as a hatchet man, because he's a finance minister, was turning all of this into a racial issue. The only thing that was turning into a racial issue was his comments, right? Yeah, but this is an illustration of the kind of, challenges that the coalition will face, and they must remain together facing these challenges if they're going to defray the detractors. Okay, so ultimately I think it'll boil down to how differences across the party platforms will be resolved, right? Putting aside the leadership issue, which I think will be the biggest challenge. So how much convergence will there be versus compromise to try and resolve or break this deadlock, right? Horse trading would be necessary, but hopefully it won't dilute the kind of reforms that are required too much, okay? I think this, more than anything else, will determine the kind of change this new coalition government will be able to deliver, and hopefully it will be more rather than less, since clearly expectations are very high, and in some sense everyone will be disappointed, but let's hope we are not too disappointed with what eventually happens. So I think I've gone a bit longer than I planned, but thank you very much for listening, and I hope to receive your questions and comments. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Menon, I'm Lee, just an entrepreneur in Penang. I actually have a very simple question, but really puzzling me. Now, the previous government, Barisan, you know, with all this, first of all, I want to thank you for all your points that pointed out, relevant, definitely is top grade. Now, the question is, in the previous government, Barisan National, how is it that the ministry and all this wrongdoing in the GLC, GLIC, whatever, without people to scrutinize, so to say, they can operate and operate until the change of government. And now we review so many sheets. Can you answer me that?
Can we have another two? Next question. The lady at the back and the gentleman in the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Two quick questions. One is you're highlighting a whole list of challenges. So which challenge should we prioritize, and do you think the current government is tackling them in the right order? And second question is, one point you pointed out is FDI. So what is the comparative advantages if I were a foreign investor, then why I would like to invest in Malaysia? I would like to hear from your opinion.
Thanks. Good evening, Dr. Menon. I think most Malaysians, if I can speak for them, agreed with the concept of the new economic policy as it was formulated in 1971. But somewhere along the line, especially after Dr. Mahathir took over, the implementation went wrong. You see, Dr. Mahathir has clear ideas. Now, I do not know of any other country, correct me if I'm wrong, which provides government assistance for people to become millionaires. Mahathir was obsessed with this idea of creating Malay millionaires. You know, that is totally wrong. There is no social or moral reason for the government to subsidize Malays to become millionaires. You have Malay individuals, businessmen, who are buying bungalows and they are given 5% discount, when a non-Malay, low-cost purchaser doesn't get any discount. See, that is where it went wrong. And I'm very pessimistic about what the government can do, because the man who was part of the problem is now supposed to be part of the solution. Now, a leopard never changes its spots. Soon after coming to power, he talks about the third Malaysian car. Now, when he was asked about the APs, he says, we must continue to give the APs to the Bumiputras. Then, he also says, Khazanah must divest its assets to Bumiputra businessmen. This is an experiment they tried. Almost every single businessman failed in 1997, 1998, because of the huge debts that they took. In fact, I have postulated a number of times that Dr. Mahathir decided not to take IMF funding and decided on capital controls. Because if they had tried the IMF remedy of increasing interest rates, every single Bumiputra enterprise, including government-linked companies, would have failed because all of them were highly geared. Now, my second question is with regard to Dr. Lim Teki's findings.
Yeah, I was about to say.
That was, in a sense, it is a question because you would have comments. You know, I cannot frame a proper question. Now, the second question is with regard to Professor Lim Teki's findings. Professor Lim Teki, a well-renowned academician, says that the Bumiputras have already achieved much more than 30% of corporate equity. So that calls into question not only those statistics, but I question almost all the statistics provided by the government. Thank you.
Thank you for. So thank you for your question. So the few questions that we have. So the previous government, how did the JLCs actually manage to hide their corruption and issues? That's the first question. Second, the second question would be which challenge among all the challenges that you pose should be prioritized, and what's the government doing about it? And also how to attract FDI to get that back on track in the country. And the third question is about basically NEP and the implementation problems and the fact that we have the man who made everything wrong at the helm now again to supposedly to make everything right. And the trust of statistics in Malaysia, like are the things that are being reported actually true? In your opinion, Dr. Menon, please. Thank you.
Very useful first set of questions. I hope they get easier as we go along. But okay, right. So actually, you started by saying you had a short and easy question. I think this is probably the most difficult one. How could it all go on for so long, right? It's, you know, we often wonder this when we find out the truth, right? How was all of this hidden for so long? How did everyone buy into it? And I guess everyone felt that, you know, things would never change, right? And the people, many people benefited, right? The GLCs provided, you know, cushy jobs for a lot of government servants, directorships, and, you know, people who worked in those GLCs, large numbers, enjoyed much better conditions and incomes. So lots of people were involved in it, and, you know, anyone who raised concerns, like me, for instance, got shot down very quickly, right? Yeah. And I'm not the only one. There's many others. You know, people like Professor Jomo and Professor Terence Gomez and many others who have been, you know, critical for a lot longer and a lot more effectively, right? You know, it was just, I guess, seen as being unpatriotic or, you know, just un-Malaysian to question, you know. Yeah, that's right. So when you're tied in to the system, you have no incentive, and if you're not, you're seen as a troublemaker and an outsider, and you're allowed to say what you want, but no one's going to really pay much attention. So I guess that things could only change when we finally changed the system. And the system was the party in power, right? And luckily that happened. Yeah. Okay, so how to prioritize the challenges. Yeah, so I think if I'm going to have to, if you force my hand and tell me what to do, I think it all starts from instituting reform to the system of governance and incentives, right? And meritocracy. So it has to start with, in some sense, an overhaul of the NEP, okay? And everything else follows, right? GLCs are linked to the NEP. I think the drop-off in investment is also linked to the investment climate, which is linked to, you know, the distortions created by the NEP. But it's not the only reason why investment has fallen, but it is one of the reasons, and it cuts across so many different areas. But I think they're all interlinked, and that's at the core that we need to address. Now, what about our comparative advantage in FDI? I think this is important but difficult question. The problem in Malaysia, I think, and this relates to some of the points that you made, which I fully agree with, is that in the heyday of FDI, we were doing so well. Penang is a classic example where the electronic sector was booming along, and everyone was expecting upgrading, right? Moving up the value chain. And that never really happened. To the extent that it did, it happened in Penang, right? In the automotive sector, the National Car Project made Thailand a beneficiary of investment, right? And today, Thailand is the one that is doing so well in terms of production of automotive parts and exports of, light vehicles and so on. So, yeah, we've got to create the environment now, I think, to try and get skills that will attract foreign investment in industries of 4.0, right? That's what we're talking about. But this is going to involve a generation, I think, right, to re-equip the labor force. Right, yeah. I think you guys know this better than I do. Okay, and all right, so you made, I think, a number of important points. I don't know if Dr. Mahathir will change his spots. He says he will, and we have no choice, okay? And let's hope he does. He's in the hot seat, and maybe he will see the benefits of being the Messiah, overriding, all other personal interests from the past. That's what I think or hope will happen, and that would be a good thing, whatever the motivation, as long as the outcomes are the right ones. But I agree, a lot of the problems we see today were either directly or indirectly instituted by him, right? Someone coming in and saying we need the rule of law when he sacked the Chief Justice is just usually not credible, right? But again, we had no choice, and now he's in power, and we hope that things are changing, right? And I think your point about the IMF is a good one, and I fully agree. And the other thing the IMF would have done, which they did as well in other countries, is come in and rip up the fiscal situation. And the fiscal situation meant the subsidies to the GLCs, and the GLCs themselves would have been at risk, and a lot of the NEP program. And that is why he could not risk an IMF-led, actually not recovery. It turned out the IMF actually got it wrong because they were too used to current account crisis, and we had a capital account crisis. And so the remedy was worse than the cure was worse than the ailment, right? And so capital controls, Malaysia did a lot better recovering than many of the other countries with IMF programs, although they all did, but perhaps with less costs in Malaysia than in the other countries. With the statistics, I think, what they say, lies, damn lies in statistics. But I think the quality of data here varies by, sector and by issue. Statistics are never perfect. I'm interested to hear that there are numbers suggesting the 30% share has already been met. But I think your earlier point is the relevant one, right? Why are we worried about asset concentration, right? If it's 30% of assets distributed amongst, equally, or not even perfectly equally, but fairly equally amongst the Malay community, that's a great thing, right? But this is through concentrations of wealth, through millionaires, who are then beholden to you, right? So it's a system that really engenders patronage and dependency, right? Yeah, and corruption. So hopefully this will not be the solution again. And as I said earlier, this has been highlighted once more by the Wall Street Journal. I'm not usually a fan of everything they say, but this time, I think when they talked about, the privatization with Winston Tan and Ananda Krishnan and all of that in the past, how will that all pan out now? We need to learn from the lessons of history and not repeat them when we try and solve the GSC problem with divestment. Otherwise, it's just, going back to repeating the mistakes of history, and I hope that doesn't happen. But thank you for your comments. I agree with what you have to say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Can we have another few questions from the floor? Gentleman in front, gentleman at the back, and lady in the second row. Thank you.
Like you, I'm an economist who also taught at Monash University. When one goes ahead and looks at questions such as the one that was posed, and the title of your discussion, and you deal only in macroeconomic facts, some of which I think are questionable, it becomes very difficult for a government to try and figure out on the basis of that area how to move ahead. Somebody talked about problems that are not economic, such as the legal system. Nobody's talked at all about the educational system, where, from what little we know, Malaysia has not done terribly well at the primary level, at the secondary level, or at the tertiary level, or even at the technical and vocational aspect of tertiary. One of the things that I have been struck about when thinking of the question is that many companies have had to do major turnarounds. Major, huge companies have had to do huge turnarounds. And there are a whole bunch of things that one has to do to get it right. One of the problems that exists in government, I think that we all know, is that we have a civil service with perhaps 100,000 or 200,000 people that have been used to working under a regime that is now being somewhat questioned or rejected. It's very difficult to turn things around in that sense. And the government of Canada, for instance, the current government, the federal government, is having a very big problem, having taken over from a 10-year reign of a politician who was more motivated by Christian fundamentalism than anything else. Anyways, I think my general question is there's much more to look at than merely macroeconomic questionable numbers.
Dr. Wong?
Thanks, Dr. Menon. Thanks for your enlightening talk. I'm Chin Huat from PENANG Institute. I have only one question. Do you think all the economic reforms you talk about, from combating corruptions and patronage to getting the right balance between meritocracy and social inclusion, would those reforms be better done with decentralization? So in the sense of, instead of talking government as a singular, should we talk about governments as plural? Thank you.
Dr. Wahifi?
I have a question from our Facebook Live. A lady stated that, needless to say, the reform of NEP to a less racist one is imperative. She wants to know whether the NEP reform needs amendment to the Constitution. Thank you.
So the three questions, Dr. Menon. So firstly, the gentleman asked about the importance of like legal systems, education systems, civil service reforms. So in that whole macroeconomic sort of presentation that you were talking about, how do these actually fit into it? Is that sort of your question? Yes. And the second question by Dr. Wong is about the economic reforms that we talk about tonight, battling corruption, meritocracy, reforming the JLCs. Would decentralization actually be more effective? So governments instead of one government. And from Facebook Live, would the reform of NEP to become not a race-based policy need constitutional reforms?
Okay. No, thanks again for another three very good questions. On your question, yeah, I mean, I of course agree with you that there's more to it than just well, I don't think I just dealt with macro issues, but economic issues, let's say, right? Yeah. And maybe the title should have been economic challenges, actually not just challenges. But you said you were an economist from Monash as well. So I'm an economist, and I don't feel capable of actually offering advice on areas like education reform and so on, where I'm not trained or skilled in. But I think I recognize the difficulties of the education system in terms of its economic implications, right? The youth unemployment, the skills mismatch, and so on. But how you fix the education system is beyond my set of skills, and I wouldn't want to venture into doing those sorts of things apart from recognizing that, as you say, these are very important issues, legal reforms, and a whole myriad of non-economic factors must come into play. And in some sense, even this government is looking at a lot of institutional reforms with the committee, apart from the eminent persons group, there's a subsidiary committee on institutional reforms, and both of them, I think, need to work together, because you cannot have economic reforms without dealing with the institutional changes, not just for implementation, but also in terms of governance and so on. So I fully agree with you, and I've kept away from them only because I don't feel, I'm the person with the right knowledge to address those things, except to recognize them and to recognize the economic impacts. But they will be as important, if not more important, in delivering the kind of results we expect from this government. Sure. The second point, I think, is a very good point, and I'm glad you raised it. And this is this whole issue of federal versus state, right? And we sometimes, I think, forget that, what is it, I think at least 5 state governments are not from the ruling coalition. And so states actually will have an important role to play in the overall reform implementation agenda, right? For one thing, we know that states have control over both land and religion, right? These are the 2 key areas where states come in. And of course, their influence extends beyond that. But, any foreign investor has to invest in a particular state. And if you want, you'll need land. And so you cannot ignore the state government. And if it's not the same as the federal, the government in the center, then there are new issues that will emerge, right? And even in terms of implementing the changes of the NEP, right? I think a difficulty will arise at the state level when the state government may not be of the same persuasion as the center. So this is going to be a big issue going forward, and I don't know how you resolve it, but it's a new challenge on top of all the other challenges of implementation between the state and the center. Yeah, thank you for raising that. So we're all celebrating this change in government, but that's just at the center. Of course, a lot of states also have the same government, but a number of them don't, and that will be a problem going forward. Does the NEP need constitutional reform? I don't think so. I mean, the Constitution recognizes a special role for the Malays, but the NEP reforms I'm talking about are not in the Constitution, right? These are policies that have been crafted usually very badly to try and improve the economic status of the Malays, and they failed, right? The majority of Malays have not really benefited from this huge transfer, apparent transfer program to help them, right? The special status is there, and that's not being discussed or debated, right? Yeah, that remains the same. But these are policy issues to deal with economic privileges, right? Economic privileges, right? Economic benefits. I shouldn't even use the word privilege because that creates different connotations. So there's nothing to do with the Constitution. As I said, if we can reform this system to break away from patronage and corruption, the main beneficiaries in the long run, I think, will be the Malays because they're the majority, if nothing else, right? Because there'll be a fairer distribution of the benefits. And I think overall, there will be gains by the reductions in inefficiencies that the current system introduces. In the end, I think more Malays will benefit and we'll have a more sustainable system. Right now, this system is leaving a huge burden for future generations, right? And the share of Malays is rising, not falling, right? So most of future generations of Malays, the majority, will be paying for the costs of the current system.
Okay, we still have time for questions, so can I have another few questions from the floor? Yes, this gentleman in front, Dr. Brema, and then gentleman at the back. Thank you.
My name is C.K. Tan from Nikkei Asian Review. I'm a reporter and happen to be here in Penang for an assignment. So when I heard that you'll be speaking here, so I thought I should drop by. My question is that you show us through the slides that the economy now basically is dominated by the services sector, and then also the oil and gas and palm oil production taking the lead. But going forward, what do you see the growth engines for the country?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions based on what you shared. The inflow of lesser skilled workers and the outflow of Malaysian skilled workers. And then when I juxtapose that against the median salary that you showed as 1,700 plus ringgit, it ties back a little bit to what was raised by this gentleman here about economy, education, migrant labor, citizenry labor, and pegging forward to what is the industry, what is the catchment for the labor, and how do we implement changes such that more people will earn more money and be more skillful with what they have. I think there's a mismatch here at policy level. The second question that I have is, I think very rightly you put up the inequalities. I know that you're an economist, but I'm curious, from a socio-economic perspective, how would you see the distribution of wealth? Because I think this is the catch that many countries go through. How do you do it with a vast population and a decentralized system of state governance? I think it is quite an impossibility sometimes to try and make it more seamless. So I would like to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Mr. Teo. I would like your opinion. If you are an investigator today, 100 days after the election, do you think Malaysia have a solid government? Do they really have one government and not everyone that change every 24 hours? That's my first. My second thing, now we are talking about NEP. The person who is responsible for that is the person who created the Bumiputra policy, is the one that is responsible for the brain drain. If they cannot tackle the Bumiputra policy, think out of the box. That means there's three things we mustn't touch in this country. The Malay rights. Must respect them, respect the king and the sultan. And thirdly, Islam. Any other thing is a fair game. Otherwise, if they don't think out of the box, Malaysia will be going down once the petrol is finished. Because until now, we are very lucky. We have gone through very hard time, but we are safe because the petrol was $100 a barrel. Remember, 2 years back, it was 35 US dollar a barrel. And the government have a hard time. And if the same problem came again, when the petrol will be about $60, $50, or we need to import petrol instead of exporting 600 barrels of petrol a day, then I can't see how Malaysia is going to feed those young generations. 60% are less than 21 years old. We have gone from 20 years ago, a population of 24 million to 32 million. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the few questions we have for this round. So the first question is that, as presented by Dr. Menon earlier on, so we are dominated currently, the economy is about services, oil, gas and palm oil. So what's the future growth engine for Malaysia's economy? The second question is to do with labor issues. So the inflow of less skilled workers and the outflow of skilled workers. So what's the catchment for that? So how do we actually raise wages and make it more productive? And the third question is from a socio-economic perspective, how would you see the distribution of wealth in that aspect? And the third person to ask questions, so is your first question about as an investor point of view? Is that what you meant? Like from an investor point of view, does Malaysia actually have a solid government currently to basically instill investor confidence again in terms of foreign direct investment? And the second question is with relation to NEP, the Bumi policy and the brain drain. So sort of like how this all goes together and how do we actually basically counter economic problems from that point of view? Is that your question about that? Okay. So how do we attract talent back, I guess, in that sense, in the light of the unfairness and things like that?
Right. Okay, so the first one in terms of growth engines going forward. You know, I guess people often talk about services as being the area where, you know, good paying jobs are available, and I'm sure they are. But I still feel that, you know, given the current circumstances in Malaysia, manufacturing still has to play a role in absorbing, you know, workers given skill levels, right? Yeah. It's always great if you can have, you know, the institutional setup in the education system and so on that will create highly skilled service providers. But I think we've gone through a few lost decades, right, where that outcome now is beyond us, right? So manufacturing is the one that can provide, absorb enough workers, and if we can start moving up the value chain in the global value chain industries that we were so good at attracting initially, then I think we can provide good jobs, still provide good jobs for large numbers of the workers, and then think about the migration to services further on. The problem now is that Malaysians expect much higher wages, and so they need to be able to provide much higher skill inputs in the manufacturing sector to justify those wages. So a bit of manufacturing still before thinking purely about services. In terms of the migrant workers and the skill outflow, I think a lot of the data, you know, on wages and so on, sometimes cannot properly separate migrant wages from local wages, and so there's some suppression of overall wages, and it might be, you know, much higher for pure Malaysians versus non-Malaysians. I don't think the data is always able to separate those things. But the point I was trying to make is that, you know, overall wages are still low, even if you were able to take that out, right? And this is a problem, and this is a concern with the cost of living going forward. And this is also a problem in many countries, right? Even with the US, right? The problem is no longer employment or reducing unemployment. It's about wages, right? And wage growth, which has become stagnant, and also in some European countries. So this seems to be a phenomenon in rich and poor countries. But in terms of wealth redistribution, this also is difficult. The tax system in this country isn't really designed to do that in an effective way. The countries that have done this have done it through land reform, right? And they found that land reform tends to also curtail future rises in inequality as you go forward, right? You look at countries like Japan and Korea that have grown sharply, raised their living standards considerably without the sharp rises in inequality, right? They've had a very much fairer land distribution and land ownership system that has kept kept ownership of land much more equitably distributed. So right now, I think, you know, if you can deal with land reform, that would be one way of arresting or reversing wealth inequality and arresting future rises in inequality going forward, but it's not easily done. This is also an issue in the country I work in, the Philippines, right? You know, who have been trying to deal with, in Cambodia, this is an issue in all these countries, all about land, and it's so difficult. But that's the key, I think, to dealing with inequality in the long term, wealth inequality. Okay, so you said, so you know, I can't, I'm not an investor, so I can't really comment as an investor, but I would hope that investors, investors usually respond to short-term factors more than long-term trends, right? That's how they have to do the sums. So maybe right now the short-term doesn't look that great, but the long-term looks more promising. So investors may not find this change in government a good thing for their immediate decision making, but hopefully they will see the value in the longer term, and that's what's important for the country anyway. I think they will come back eventually, but even if there's some sort of negative reaction in the short term. And I agree with you that, you know, there has been this brain drain. It's been documented. Whether we'll have a brain gain with, non-resident Malaysians returning home to Malaysia Baru to try and help, contribute to the development. Hopefully that will happen, as we've seen in countries like India, where a lot of, non-resident Indians or NRIs have come back, and usually for, quite so-called selfish reasons, because they see opportunities to, invest in new areas. They return home, they set up businesses, and they do quite well. When India went through the huge Big Bang reform program, right? So maybe something like that might happen here, hopefully. Finally, you made some points about oil prices and their role. I agree with that, and I think for a long time, a lot of the excesses in terms of, subsidizing the GLCs were made possible because of high oil prices. Oil prices are not that high anymore, but they are coming back a little bit. But I also worry about the ability of this government to retain the original budget deficit forecast of the previous government, right? By the GST did provide, whatever you think of it, it did provide quite a boon to fiscal coffers. The substitute will not. And there's some unrealistic assumptions about dividends from GLCs in the current budget estimates, which I don't think will be realized. And I don't know if they can really stick to the previous government's budget estimate for the deficit. I think it will have to widen, and that's part of the process, because they have committed to increase social spending as well in several areas. And this is something, they'll just have to wear. But the budget deficit is not at critical level, so it can grow, it can expand a little bit while they institute these new policies. But they'll have to rein it in the longer term. But I don't think they can stick with the current budget deficit forecast. It's unrealistic.
Thank you, Dr. Menon. So it's already past 9:30, so we have reached the end of our event. Thank you everyone for coming tonight and for your participation. Let's give Dr. Menon a round of applause.